Before the Great Depression turned Herbert Hoover's name into a synonym for presidential failure, he was actually one of the most respected men in America. After the outbreak of World War I, Hoover had organized a relief effort that saved millions from starvation in war-torn Belgium. He was later the food administrator under Woodrow Wilson and Secretary of Commerce for both Harding and Coolidge.
History has badly blighted his reputation because he had the huge misfortune to be in office during the Depression. Hoover was elected president in 1928 because he was universally understood as probably the largest public figure of the entire preceding decade.
Number 31, Herbert Hoover, Republican, 1929 to 1933, 54 years old, from California. Hoover was the first president born west of the Mississippi. Orphaned as a boy in Iowa and taken in by relatives on the West Coast, Hoover was a shy loner with a tendency toward melancholy. After graduating from Stanford, he built a successful mining company that made him a millionaire. Like many presidents, fishing was his favorite pastime. And then there was Hoover Ball. Told by a White House doctor that he needed to exercise, Hoover came up with his own game.
Hoover Ball was one of those ways of not only stimulating physical exercise, but encouraging the leaders of the government to get together every morning before they started their workday to share ideas.
Hoover was often seen as a big business Republican who didn't relate to the common man.
He wore those stiff double-breasted suits and the big high collar and so on. And his personal demeanor was quite stiff and reserved, so it was easy to lampoon him and caricature him as a stereotypical big businessman.
Hoover was indeed a businessman, one of an early handful of international capitalists, but he also had a highly developed sense of social obligation.
Herbert Hoover once said that the only trouble with capitalism is capitalists. They're too damned greedy. So I don't think, as we look at big business today, and we look at things like Enron and other corporations, that Herbert Hoover would have approved at all. He would have been appalled at those industry leaders and what they did. Ashamed, indeed.
Hoover did try to apply the efficiency of business management to his task as president.
It's true that George W. Bush is the first MBA to be president of the United States, but Herbert Hoover was a very successful business person, and he had a very crisp executive style.
Herbert Hoover was what we now call a workaholic. I mean, this was a man who really believed in work. He's the man who's always on the job and believes that if only I can work harder and only I can put more hours in on it, I'll solve the problem.
With his strong work ethic and proven management skills, Hoover seemed destined for presidential greatness.
The only problem was that the economy totally tanked as of October 1929. Many of the qualities that made him look that he would be so good for leading a period of prosperity were really not up to dealing with the challenges of the Depression.
As a Depression president, Hoover was handicapped by his innate lack of charisma. His lackluster public speeches did little to inspire confidence.
What our people need is the restoration of their normal jobs, the recovery of agricultural prices, and the business.
Hoover didn't believe in using direct government intervention to ward off the Depression. Instead, he relied on what he called voluntarism, asking corporations to voluntarily improve working conditions and wages.
If I could have counseled Herbert Hoover in 1930 or 1931, I would have said, Mr. President, the government needs to do more. Voluntarism isn't going to work. Unfortunately, I think what happened to Hoover was that the Depression traumatized him.
He made his plight much worse by becoming extremely defensive. He just didn't have the temperament, among other things, to deal with a crisis of this magnitude.
On the 8th day of November,
Hoover had the misfortune of running for re-election in the depths of the Depression. The 1932 campaign turned his name into a permanent punchline.
A Hoover hotel was a cardboard shack. A Hooverville was a collection of cardboard shacks. A Hoover flag was an empty pocket turned inside out.
The summer of 1932 was miserable for Hoover. He hit the campaign trail and tried to put on a brave face.
Wherever he appeared, there were angry Americans with signs critical of him. There were people who shouted, "We want bread." And everywhere he went was the specter of hunger. It must have hurt him tremendously to campaign.
In June, a contingent of desperate World War I veterans arrived in Washington to demand early payment of bonuses that weren't due to be paid until 1945. When these bonus marchers occupied several buildings in downtown Washington, Hoover enlisted the help of General Douglas MacArthur to clear them out.
MacArthur exceeded his authority and not only evacuated the buildings, but pressed all the way on to Anacostia Flats, where there was this encampment of the so-called bonus marchers, and he torched the encampment, burned it to the ground. MacArthur never took the rap for this. He exceeded his orders and exceeded his authority from President Hoover. Hoover took the blame for this politically, and this was, in a sense, the last nail in his political coffin.
When Hoover's challenger, Franklin Roosevelt, heard about the debacle, he told an advisor, "This elects me."
What Roosevelt offered was a sense of hope that even if today I don't have enough to eat, or even if today I don't have a job, it will be better tomorrow. Whereas it seemed that during Hoover's administration, it just wasn't getting any better.
Still, some historians think that looking at Hoover through the prism of FDR is unfair.
Imagine if somebody like FDR had been in office in 1929. You know, somebody, a real public charmer, you know, glad-hander. By 1932, they would have been clamoring for somebody different, somebody who's not a politician, somebody who understands the economy, somebody like Herbert Hoover.